Nabeel Shaath, the former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Information for the Palestine National Authority, was in Cyprus this week. I spoke to him about his work with the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and his reasons for coming to Cyprus. What actually are you doing in Cyprus at the moment?
Cyprus is an old friend. I've come to Cyprus when I was 10 years old. Long time ago, and I've come to Cyprus several times. I was the Foreign Minister of Palestine, Deputy Prime Minister of Palestine, and part of it was at the time that Mr. Kassoulidis was also the Foreign Minister at that time.
So you're meeting old friends?
Very much so, a real good friend. But we have also many other friends with all the parties, with Akil and with EDEC and with the Democratic Party, and we have friends here over a long time. I have many students here. I was the Dean of the School of Management at the American University in Beirut at one time, so I have many students who are Cypriot and who are here. And therefore, I'm coming to a friendly country with friendly people, with a joint history of struggling against British occupation at one time and against other types of occupations from in our country, the Israeli occupation. And therefore, our quest for liberation, for independence, for unity was really a shared quest. We supported each other all the time.
But Cyprus has got very friendly with Israel since the discovery of the hydrocarbons. How far has that changed your ability to count on their friendship and support for the Palestinian cause?
So that's what I'm trying to really find out with this trip. I was invited officially by Mr. Kassoulidis and by the President Anastasiadis. So I'm the guest of your government really here. And I'm coming as an envoy of our President Abu Mazen, but also I'm the Foreign Relations Commissioner of the Fatah party, the leading party. And so I immediately accepted the invitation because I really wanted to see for myself. We don't mind at all that Cyprus builds good relations, economic relations and so on with the Israelis as with the Russians or with the Americans for that matter. Question is that we should not be made to pay the price of that rapprochement, that our right as a people who are under occupation and under exploitation and under the threat of colonial settlement in every part of our country. I needed to know that Cyprus remains committed to that did not sell that out in order to get better economic relations with the Israelis. And I'm getting assurances everywhere I go, starting with the President, to the Speaker of the Parliament and President of the Parliament, and the Foreign Minister, presidents of different parties. I'm really getting very believable, very friendly, very intimate assurances that is not the case, that their economic relations with the Israelis and their rapprochement with the Israelis is not something that we have to pay the price of, that they remain committed to the rights of the Palestinians to liberate their land, to build their independent state, to have rights, that they are still committed to really protest and help us stop the colonial settlement movement of the Israelis on our land. None of that has changed. And that they are willing to show this in a variety of ways. Programs of cultural exchange, economic relations, and political commitment in the European Union and the international organizations and everywhere. And I also told them, all the countries we have relations with and who are very close to us have relations with Israel. I mean, Sweden has relations with Israel, Russia has relations, China, India.
So
Britain,
you're not asking
France.
for, as no country can, of course, in the modern globalised world, for, in a sense, preferential treatment, because you know that everybody has to talk to everybody else. But if we come to the talks over the years that the Palestinians have had with the Israelis, and particularly the Oslo Accord, because I think you were partly responsible in the I didn't want to say partly to blame, but you were partly responsible, certainly, for drawing that up. Now, the breakthrough, as I understand it, was achieved by separating the interim settlement from the final settlement. until then, Palestinians had always said, no, we have to have the final settlement. But at Oslo, you agreed to go along with the Israeli stance that the two should be separated. So you signed something that, in effect, meant that you'd agreed to something, whereas the Israelis had no clear commitment on permanent settlement. Was that a mistake?
That's not the mistake. That we committed many mistakes. I will talk about some of them. But we did not give up the permanent settlement for the interim settlement. We accepted a package in which the interim leads invariably and almost automatically into the permanent.
So why didn't it?
Okay. Why didn't it? The Israelis, of course, had to accept that package at a time when they really could not say no. It was a time where the world was changing. The Soviet Union went out of business. The Arabs fought with the Americans against an Arab country, Iraq, and the American campaign there succeeded. And therefore, the Americans emerged from 1991, that's the year we started the negotiations, as the supreme owners of the universe. Okay? And when they said they were willing to take that agreement and implement it, we could not say no. That agreement was made really in Oslo and signed in Washington. But it was really just a continuation of an effort that the United States had started with the Madrid conference in 1991. And therefore, eventually, it was the product of the Americans.
But was it ever going to work if there was no comeback on either of the sides, if they didn't stick to their side of the agreement?
Okay, but that's really precisely the mistake of the Americans. I mean, the Americans promised that they will make sure that the two parties implement each their own commitments. But they never did. They put always the pressure on us, with very, very little pressure. Sometimes they put some pressure on the Israelis, but they didn't do anything to the continuing colonial settlement that really robbed our land and our water for free for the Israelis. They didn't do anything. They didn't do anything about the lack of respect by the Israelis of the conditions of the agreement, particularly the timing of the agreements. We should have finished everything in 5 years. We should have finished the interim period in 2 years. We could have started actually the permanent with the interim as the agreement permitted, but the Americans said, why don't you give yourself a chance to test the Israelis, and told the Israelis, why don't you have a chance to test the Palestinians? So start with 2 years of interimness and then move into the permanent negotiations.
But it's really vital.
But then things change. You see, this is the problem. As we went along, when the United States found itself to be really and truly the sole owner of the universe, and the Israelis recognized that, it was much easier for the Israelis to gain American support for us to do the same.
But Israel is a past master at gaining support in important countries. How far does the Palestinian Authority and do the Palestinians as a whole believe that they need to up their game in terms of the public relations, the public opinion?
We have made lots of success in the last 2-3 years in that regard, in particular. I mean, the fact that now 139 countries recognize Palestine as an independent state, with East Jerusalem its capital, on the borders of 1967, is really a progress that really it would have been very difficult to have seen 20 years ago.
Sure, but forgive me, there's no sign of that state actually coming about in real terms, and the settlement building goes on unabated, with a few slaps on the wrist possibly from the American president saying, oh, please stop doing that, it doesn't help, but little else.
I agree with you, but I was responding to the question about our public relations ability to gain friends. The question is not only that. We have been able to gain lots of friends, but what you're saying, these friends have not yet been able to translate their friendship into action on the ground to force the Israelis out of their colonial practices.
Do you think they will be able to do that at some point?
I think so. The only other alternative is to go back to violence, and we don't want to go back to violence.
Well, we have, to a certain degree, already gone back to violence, haven't we? I mean, what are your thoughts
the
on
Israelis
the
never
current...
stopped using violence.
No, sure. But what are your thoughts on this current upsurge in individual stabbings of Israelis and the, I think most people would say, disproportionate response from the IDF?
Absolutely.
And how on earth do you calm things down?
Look, the Israelis call their violence security and our violence terrorism. That is, if we really in any way fight back by knives or by guns or whatever, even if we fight back by going to the United Nations to complain about them, this is terrorism. But if they kill 4,500 Palestinians in Gaza and destroy half the homes of Gaza, that's a necessity of security. They are just obtaining security by doing that. But this misuse of language through euphemisms like this, it has really stopped being very effective in the world opinion. The world understands more, but your question is not about the world understanding us, understanding our rights. You're really asking the crucial question of when does that understanding turn into action to put pressure on Israel not to do so? I mean, the Russians occupied the Ukraines, okay, or parts of the Ukraine, encouraged problems inside the Ukraines. So immediately Europe and America started serious actions and sanctions against the Russian Union. They don't do that to Israel. Iran was suspected of starting to build an atomic bomb before the negotiations ended. So the whole world put pressures worth $240 billion on the Iranians, which helped very much put pressure on the Iranians to go to the agreement to stop building a nuclear bomb. But they wouldn't do that to Israel.
Well, Israel doesn't even admit that it's already got one, does it? And we all know it has.
Oh, God's 200 of them. 200 bombs they have. They are the fourth largest nuclear power in the world, and the third largest air force in the world, and their per capita income is 40 times the per capita income of the Palestinians.
Now, that's something else I wanted to talk to you about, because way back when you were in charge, I think, actually, of the economy of the Palestinian areas.
I was a planning minister at one time.
And at the beginning there was huge growth. Things were going very nicely.
Correct.
Now, I obviously understand that in Gaza in particular, you're not going to get growth because you haven't any longer got the infrastructure there. But what, if anything, can the Palestinian Authority do about trying to improve the economic lot of the Palestinians?
Today it's very difficult because the Israelis have already taken most of the land and the water anyway, our resources. And they stopped us from using the gas that we found in the shores of Gaza. And therefore, I mean, you wouldn't believe it, but the Israelis today take 92% of our water and give it to their settlers, whereas the 4.5 million Palestinians get 8% of the water produced in our land. Therefore, we hardly can make the deserts bloom, as the Israelis used to say. The Israelis have taken control now of 62% of the West Bank. And that is the heart of the West Bank and the River Jordan Valley of the West Bank. We really only have today the area of our cities and big towns. We don't have much agricultural land or water, have been taken all by the Israelis. So the question is really, how do you really build an economy when somebody is taking your land, is taking your water, is taking your minerals, is controlling all your borders, is forcing you to import only from him, levying all kinds of penalties and sanctions against you when you do anything that doesn't please him? We are subjugated to Israeli military control to make economic gains for the Israelis. I mean, it's very difficult today to see how can we escape that without getting rid of the occupation first and gaining some measure of independence that will allow us to start building our economy. In 1994, it was different. In 1994, the world then was really quite willing to put pressure on the Israelis to give us a chance to build that independent Palestinian state. I remind you, The Israelis did not want to go to the Madrid conference. And the Americans stopped paying them $10 billion in loan guarantees to force them to go to the Madrid conference. And therefore, when we started the authority, we got a lot of aid from the Americans and a lot of aid from the Europeans. I was the minister in charge. I signed an agreement of associate membership to the EU only in 3 months and 2 days, which was phenomenal. No country in the world was able to negotiate itself as an associate member of the EU in 3 months. It took Egypt 16 years. I got a free trade agreement with the United States and Canada. So there was a willingness of the international community to help Palestine to really get started. And we had an Israeli government that also believed that it had to do this for the interest of the Israelis themselves, to produce peace and eventually economic relations with all the Arabs via its agreement with the Palestinians. There was somebody called Ishaq Rabin who really believed that this is the time to make peace with the Palestinians. The Ishaq Rabin era went out. And you have now a government that believes that all of this land is theirs and they have to really make a Jewish homeland on our land, and that their history gives them the right to do so all over the West Bank. And you really have an international community that may find our case to be, to make them sympathetic, but they're not yet ready to put the kind of pressure that has been put on Iran or on Russia or on other countries in order to get the Israelis to be in peace and in real security and in real prosperity.
Can I ask you about whether or not your thoughts on the two-state solution have changed if you look now at the map, the walls, and the whole way that the geography of the West Bank has changed?
Well, I understand that that's exactly what the Israelis want. They want us to give up. And maybe to leave our country to them. Already half the Palestinian people have been forced to immigrate out of Palestine. We are now 14 million people, the Palestinians. 7 million of us are either in refugee camps in the Arab world around us, or in Europe and America and Latin America and Australia as immigrants. But we have not given up.
But you're still with a two-state solution, or do you think that a one-state solution in a sort of confederation, much like Cyprus is negotiating now, could actually be the answer?
My choice was always a one-state solution. We had to take the two-state solution when the Israelis and the Americans totally rejected a one-state solution. I wrote in 1969 a series of articles about a non-sectarian, secular, democratic state for the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims in the whole of Palestine. But the there was absolutely no Israeli that accepted it, by the way. They wanted their own state. Okay, so we had to eventually go to accept a two-state solution. But the real solution is a one-state solution. Why not have in Palestine and Israel just one state, just like the United States, or just like Australia, or just like what South Africa has become today, a tolerant, secular, progressive, democratic state for all its people? Of course I would go to that. But who wants it? The Israelis don't.
To the Palestinians, because the last question I want to ask you is about the divisions within Palestinian politics. You represent Fatah, and of course everybody's heard of Hamas. Now, I think it was back in 2014, there was an agreement, there was a unity government, and it was praised by almost every large country that could still put pressure on Israel. What happened? What changed that it seems once again that there is not a unified Palestinian approach, and that also undermines the efforts of the Palestinian people?
I agree with you on the conclusion, no doubt. I think we have to get out of this disunity and bring back unity, as much as you in Cyprus really need to do that yourselves. And in the two cases, there are other parties that make it difficult. In your case and in our case. The Israelis actually created all the conditions to cut Gaza out. They withdrew from Gaza and totally encircled it from the sea, from the land, and from the air, and therefore cut physically all its relationship with the West Bank. And that led to Hamas taking over Gaza and separating Gaza from the West Bank. Now the question is, how do you reunite them? And
especially since they are physically separated.
Yeah, very much so. We have really been negotiating for a long time. And one obstacle after another have really vanished. At one time, we differed on political ideology, on political strategy, on so many things. Today, they agree that the need is to build an independent Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza, and not only liberate all of Palestine, as they used to say. Now they agree on elections to elect a unity government.
How can you, as part of the, let's say, official Palestinian voice recognised by all the governments we've been talking about, persuade those governments that Hamas was actually elected by the people of Gaza and should be taken off that terrorist list?
The Europeans are really accept that. I mean, all of Europe will accept our unity, which will allow Hamas to be legitimized and to run into any election. But the United States and Israel, of course, still say no. Now, we don't care if they say no or not. The question is how to convince our brothers in Hamas to come to joint elections in the West Bank and Gaza and give up an independent entity in Gaza. And as I said before, at one time they posited many arguments about the difference in our strategy and our ideology. They want an Islamist state and all of that. Today, these things have vanished. Today, the only problem left for us to agree on unity is what to do with the employees that Hamas hired, whether military employees or civilian employees. They want the Palestinian new government to accept all of them in the civil service of the new government. And now they're talking about 70,000, which will more than double the number of total employees we have today. So the problem now is really economic, financial.
But do you still have what you could call a unity government? Because since that sort of handshaking and unity in 2014, we've heard nothing more about that.
No, there is what is called now a unity government. But that unity government does not really have much power in Gaza. Hamas is still running things the way they want to, but using support from that unity government for education, for the power station, for the purchase of electricity and water. All of this is done now by the government in the West Bank. But the government in the West Bank does not really have much control of Gaza. And if there will be real unity between Gaza and the West Bank, then we have to go to elections.
But it's also, as I said, so difficult when there's a physical separation. Here in Cyprus, we can walk over to the north. The Turkish Cypriots can come over to the south. We can mix, we can mingle, we can discuss. Is that something that, if you could achieve, you feel would move things forward?
When we signed the Oslo Agreement, a very important part of it was building a safe road between Gaza and the West Bank. The Israelis never allowed it to be built, or even to use their own roads to do it. But they allowed us, if we get a permission from the Israeli military, to travel from Gaza to the West Bank via Israeli roads and back. So today we don't have a safe passage, and that really makes things more difficult. There are problems between the Hamas and Egypt today, which is blocking the road between Gaza and Egypt. We used to go to Egypt and from Egypt to Gaza to avoid going through Israel. But today that is also a problem. The Gazans are suffering.
The last time I spoke to Ioannis Kassoulidis, I think, about the situation in Palestine, he was talking about the possibility of Cyprus somehow being involved in guaranteeing a port facility. And I know it's something that in Gaza they desperately need, don't they?
There are two projects here being discussed. One, which was really a project I supported, 6 years ago actually, is to rent 2 piers in the Limassol port and have an international inspection unit there. So boats going to Gaza will come to Cyprus first, they will be searched, and then they will be escorted to Gaza, which the Israelis cannot object that they will be carrying any explosives or anything like that. And then now there is a Turkish project to build a Gaza port managed by the Turks. You see, again, your problem now is translating itself also to our problem. We don't mind either, but the question is, we don't want an independent port of Gaza to reincarnate and to deepen the disunity. We want it to remain as an incentive for unity. That is, if you unite, we will build a port. But until we build it, we will rent a port from the Cypriots. So that can happen only if Hamas really feels it has become that close to making unity, that this will be the icing on the pudding or the icing on the cake. That if you go to unity, that will bring to Gaza a port.
But then the other argument might be that bringing a port to Gaza would have such a huge impact on the economy that life would be so much better for the people of Gaza that they wouldn't be looking to hardliners in Hamas the way they do now.
Well, I will just shift that argument a little bit by saying, whatever the situation is, we care about our people in Gaza and we would want to give them a decent life with whatever. But we think that decent life will be so much more possible if we unite. That is, if we remain disunited and they have their ports which encourage Hamas to continue the disunity, that might delay the day. I am optimistic enough to think, like what I heard from President Anastasiadis today, he thinks that maybe you are so close to unity in Cyprus that it might even happen before the end of the year. I think that is the same. This is my feeling about Gaza and the West Bank, that we may be able to find a solution before the end of this year, and therefore the port and the rented piers will be the icing on the cake.
Let's certainly hope so. That's a forward-looking Nabeel Shaath, former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Information for the Palestinian National Authority and now the Fatah Foreign Commissioner. Let's hope that 2016 does indeed prove to be the year when we see peace in our region.